All right, we last left off talking about the East African kingdoms, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the West African kingdoms. Most of these kingdoms, they're really the center of most of the focus that we're going to talk about is going to be related to the kingdoms of Mali, Ghana, and Songhai. These three kingdoms really were the dominant kingdoms throughout much of the time period. And they're really going to dominate through control of different regions, but also probably the most important factor here is going to be controlling trade. And then later on, a connection we have between these kingdoms and the Middle East, which is going to bring Islam to this area and is going to impact this area through today, where we can see through trade routes and the dominance of Islam in Western Africa in modern society, what a huge impact this is going to have over time. The biggest form of trade that's going to take place during this time period is the trade of gold and salt. So, if you think about today and you think of the value of a pound of salt, let's say you run down to Hannaford and you need to get some salt. A parent wants you to pick up some salt because they have a recipe that they're cooking and they want you to buy one of those big little round jugs of the salt. Probably going to cost you a couple of dollars, right? If, on the other hand, you needed to go and buy the same value or the same weight of gold, you're talking probably tens of thousands of dollars for that gold, if not more. During the gold salt trade, during this time period, however, we have a situation where the value of gold and the value of salt were equal. Now, you might ask yourself, how could that possibly be, right? Salt is readily available. It comes from the earth. You can harvest it out of the ocean, and gold is much more rare. And so just simple supply and demand laws, you're thinking that can't possibly be. But there are parts of Africa where salt was not readily available. And salt is a necessity. Salt is something that people need for a lot of different reasons. First and foremost, probably the most obvious, is for seasoning. Things that aren't quite as obvious would be biology. We need a certain level of sodium in order for our hearts to function and our bodies to function appropriately. And then lastly, for the preservation of things like meat. Adding salt cures the meat. So you could, before refrigeration, you could salt the meat, wrap it up in leaves, maybe bury it in the ground or keep it in a location in your home. And that salt would cure the beef or the meat, whatever it was. And then you can cut away at that and have access to fresh meat over a longer period of time. Likewise, gold is going to be in high demand. So what we're talking about is really a north-south trade, as you can see on this map here. In the north, they had salt, an abundance of salt. And in the south, they had an abundance of gold. And so this trade is really going to dominate much of West Africa. And it's this trade that's really going to bring Islam to West Africa. You can see here the Islamic influences. Ghana, Mali, and Songhai are all going to have big influences of Islam. The big one's going to be Mansa Musa. You can see him there under Mali. Mansa Musa is going to complete the Hajj. And remember when we talked about Islam, the Hajj is that pilgrimage that Muslims are required to make to the holy city of Mecca. Mansa Musa, a king, actually does this Hajj. He travels across the Sahara Desert, across North Africa, to the city of Mecca. And he brings with him riches and a huge caravan of people. And when he returns, what it essentially does is open up West Africa to the Middle East and just kind of influences that area with a heightened amount or an increased amount of Islamic worship and practice, but also it connects those two regions. And so now we're going to start to have a flow of cultural and societal and religious sharing that's going to happen between these two regions. You can see on this table kind of just some of the key components about these West African kingdoms, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. And then we're going to move a little bit on here to just what society was like in much of Africa during this early time period. So we call this Indigenous African society. Think of it as tribal African society or early native societies. So the word indigenous means existing, born, or produced in a land or region. So these are the people who are original to an area. And this is what we refer to as indigenous. We'll be talking about indigenous people in every unit we do this year. When we look at African society, there are a couple key components we need to talk to about as far as the way that their families are set up. So extended families are going to be really important in Africa. Extended families are those families beyond the immediate family, so it will include grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. We also see societies that are both patriarchal or matriarchal. So patriarchal societies are going to be male-dominated societies. Matriarchal societies will be female-dominated societies. They're fewer, but they do exist. And then we'd have to decide or differentiate between societies in the way that they carry down tradition through the family. And these are called matrilineal and patrilineal. Patrilineal societies are where the familial descent, the family descent, is passed on from the father to the eldest son. And that's the majority of societies throughout history. But we do have some matrilineal societies where the familial descent is passed on from the mother to the eldest daughter. Aspects of that would be societies like some of the Hebrew societies where really the religious trait is passed on through the mother to the daughter and it follows through the woman. We have here a chart of social hierarchy within most of these indigenous societies. And this is going to be important because really it's this affinity or this affiliation to the tribe that's going to be an important aspect of everything that happens through African society up until today. So the tribe is the larger ethnic group, and a tribe is made up of several different clans, and every clan can trace its family descent to one common ancestor. So you might have, 20 clans within a tribe. Another major aspect here is age-set systems. We basically live in an age-set system. School is an age-set system where everybody of the same comparable age kind of goes through a learning process together. In Africa, this has to do a lot with not just learning, but also becoming an adult within the society. You can then see we have an extended family, nuclear family, which is just your immediate family, parents and children, and then the role of the individual within all of this. The biggest problem we're going to see over time with tribes is the modern nation state and the ways in which tribes, because of colonial boundaries, ended up being kind of put together. And sometimes rival tribes placed in one area together, where as these countries become independent, or as these colonies become independent nation states, we're going to see tribes and your affiliation to a tribe being more important than that nation. And so control over areas is going to plunge some of these areas into civil war. And the delineation, the differences between the groups that are fighting in these civil wars really oftentimes comes down to tribal affiliation. And it really prevents some of these countries from having any kind of concrete unity. This also is going to have communication problems because a lot of these people are not going to communicate with each other, or they tend to go into their own little tribal aspects. We have this intertribal warfare that will take place. In Rwanda, we have a situation we'll talk about later on where you have two different tribes, the Hutu and the Tutsi, that plunges the country into genocide as one group attacks another over power and over rule. And it's long, and there are a lot of historical aspects to it. But really what it came down to was tribal affiliation, and that was kind of how you associated yourself with others. The other thing that's had an impact on this has been urbanization, the growth of cities, where people from various tribes are living in close proximity to one another. And generally in cities, you're going to start to see these barriers fall down because people are dealing with each other on a daily basis. They work in the same places. So those stereotypes start to kind of break down over time. So urbanization can be a benefit, but it can also be a problem. Animism is a religious practice in Africa, believes in one supreme God, and probably the key part of this is going to be the idea that there are spirits in nature that inhabit nature and inhabit animals. Also the idea that your ancestors can be these spirits that can have an impact on you and your life. And then the idea that there are medicine men or diviners who can harness these powers and can control them.